The oppressive heat of an August afternoon hung heavily in the air as David Keaton pulled into the driveway of his stately home in Silverwood Estates. The house, usually a haven of quiet after his long days at the real estate firm, now felt different, off. He wasn't supposed to be home this early, but after a canceled meeting, he decided to surprise his wife, Rachel. Maybe they could steal a quiet lunch together, something they hadn't done in months. As David turned off the ignition, he noticed a car parked just down the street. It belonged to the Holloway's son Mark, who often did odd jobs around the neighborhood. He'd been around their house a lot recently, helping with the garden and little repairs, but something about seeing his car there unsettled David. Shrugging off the thought, he grabbed his briefcase and headed inside. The moment I opened the front door, the thick, stifling heat outside was replaced with an unsettling silence inside. He could see Rachel's sun hat hanging by the entrance, and a half-empty glass of wine on the kitchen counter. It was strange, too early in the day for her to be drinking. His steps were slow and deliberate as he moved through the house. Something felt wrong. As he ascended the stairs, he heard it. A muffled sound from the bedroom. His heart raced. With each step, his mind spun, trying to make sense of the noise. Maybe she was watching TV, maybe it was nothing. But as he pushed open the door to the bedroom, all the air was sucked from the room. There, in their bed, was Rachel, his wife of 15 years, and Mark Holloway, half-dressed, tangled in a shameful embrace. For a moment, the world stood still. His brain struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. The blood drained from his face as a hot, suffocating rage filled the hollow space left by his shock. "What the hell are you doing?" David's voice erupted, shaking the stillness of the room. Rachel's head snapped around, her face pale with fear and guilt. "David, wait, this isn't—" Rachel started, scrambling to cover herself, but her words were drowned out by the deafening roar in David's ears. Mark stumbled back, his hands up in defense. "Mr. Keaton, But David couldn't hear them. He couldn't think. All he could see was the betrayal, the violation of everything he had built, of the life he had fought for. Without warning, he lunged forward, his fists clenched tight, fueled by pure, unadulterated rage. He tackled Mark to the floor, the two of them crashing into the dresser. The sharp thud of bodies colliding with wood echoed in the room. But it wasn't enough. The fury inside him demanded more. Rachel screamed, "Stop! David, stop it!" She tried to pull him off, but David was far beyond reason. His eyes locked onto a crystal vase on the nightstand, an anniversary gift from Rachel, of all things. In the madness of the moment, it became a weapon, and with one swift motion, he swung it at Mark. The sickening crack of glass on skull was deafening, followed by a dull thud as Mark's body went limp. Silence. For the first time since he'd opened that door, the room fell into a harrowing silence, save for Rachel's sobs. David stood over Mark's body, still gripping the shattered vase, his chest heaving with exertion and rage. Slowly, the realization of what he had done began to sink in. His hands, slick with blood, shook as the adrenaline faded, leaving only the cold, sickening reality in its place. Rachel knelt beside Mark's lifeless form, her cries growing more desperate as she pressed her hands to his head, trying to stop the bleeding. "Oh my God, David, what have you done? What have you done?" David stumbled back, his legs weak, his heart pounding so loudly it was all he could hear. He collapsed into the chair by the window, dropping the vase, which shattered on the floor beneath him. He buried his face in his hands, his mind a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and regret. Then, from somewhere far off, the distant wail of sirens pierced the silence. Help was on the way, but it was far too late to save any of them from the devastation that had already been unleashed. In the hours following the attack, the weight of what had transpired seemed to hang over the Keaton home like a thick, suffocating fog. The silence, once a comforting escape from the bustle of David Keaton's professional life, now pressed down on him with unbearable heaviness. Rachel's sobs echoed faintly from somewhere in the house, but he couldn't bring himself to move. The realization of what he had done pulsed through him like a low, constant ache, a pain he wasn't sure he could ever shake. As the minutes ticked by, memories of how they had arrived at this moment played out in his mind, each one bringing a fresh wave of nausea. David and Rachel Keaton had once been the envy of Silverwood Estates. They were the couple with the perfect house, the perfect careers, the perfect life. At least, that's how it appeared from the outside. David's real estate development firm had taken off in the early years of their marriage, allowing them to move into the sprawling modern home that now felt like a prison. Rachel, once a vibrant force in the art world, had slowly withdrawn from her career after their move to Silverwood, becoming more isolated as the years went on. The cracks had started small. At first, it was nothing more than the long hours David spent at the office, Late-night meetings, client dinners, weekends filled with work trips. At the time, Rachel had reassured herself it was temporary, a necessary evil to ensure their future. But as the years passed, the distance between them grew. The moments of connection became fewer and further apart, until all that remained were brief conversations about schedules and responsibilities. The intimacy they had once shared, the closeness that had defined the early years of their relationship, was gone. Rachel had always been the more creative, free-spirited one. She had thrived in the chaos of the art gallery, surrounded by people who admired her vision and talent. But after settling into Silverwood Estates, her days became a monotonous cycle of charity events, yoga classes, and empty social obligations. At first, she had convinced herself she was happy. She had everything she could have wanted, didn't she? A beautiful home, financial security, and a husband who, at least in theory, loved her. But as time wore on, the quiet moments of reflection became harder to ignore. She had poured herself into projects, yoga classes at the studio, charity galas for local causes, anything to fill the void that had begun to grow inside her. But even those distractions had started to lose their luster. The truth gnawed at her late at night, long after David had fallen asleep. She was lonely. More than that, she felt invisible. And then came Mark Holloway. Mark had been a familiar face around the neighborhood for years, the quiet, thoughtful boy who helped with yard work and odd jobs when he wasn't away at college. To Rachel, he had always seemed distant, polite but aloof. She barely noticed him when he came over to trim the hedges or fix a loose shutter. But as the summer of 2020 dragged on, with David away more and more, Mark had slowly become a fixture in her day-to-day life. It started innocently enough, a casual conversation by the garden while Mark worked on the landscaping. Rachel, desperate for any form of connection, had opened up to him in ways she hadn't to anyone in years. She had found herself telling him about her art, her dreams of curating exhibits again, her frustration with the life she had found herself trapped in. Mark had listened, his quiet attentiveness offering a balm to her wounded pride. Over the course of the summer, their conversations became more frequent, their interactions less formal. There was an ease between them that Rachel had missed, a feeling of being seen. Before long, she found herself looking forward to his visits, watching for his car as it pulled up in front of the house. It was an excitement she hadn't felt in years, a dangerous thrill that grew with each passing week. But even as the attraction between them became impossible to ignore, Rachel had tried to convince herself that it was harmless, a distraction. She was too old, too settled, too married for anything to come of it. And yet, the more time they spent together, the more the boundaries blurred. One sweltering afternoon, after another one of their increasingly intimate conversations, Rachel had felt something shift between them. It was as though the air had become charged, filled with a tension she could no longer deny. When Mark reached for her hand, she hadn't pulled away. In that moment, something in her snapped, and the passion she had buried for so long rose to the surface. That was the beginning of the affair. It had been reckless. She knew that. Each time they met in secret, the risk of discovery loomed large. But it was like an addiction. Each stolen moment with Mark brought her back to life in a way she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't thinking about the consequences. She wasn't thinking about David. But now, as the reality of Mark's lifeless body lying upstairs settled over her like a suffocating weight, Rachel realized just how wrong she had been. David's thoughts, meanwhile, were consumed with a different kind of self-recrimination. He had known something was wrong for months, maybe even years, but he had buried his suspicions beneath the distractions of work, choosing to ignore the warning signs, the late-night text messages, the secretive phone calls. The way Rachel had grown distant in recent months, he had convinced himself it was stress, that his wife was just going through a phase. He hadn't wanted to confront the truth, that his marriage had been crumbling around him for longer than he cared to admit. As the sirens grew louder in the distance, David's mind raced with possibilities. What would happen when the police arrived? What would they think? What story would Rachel tell them? His eyes darted around the room, lingering on the broken vase, the blood-stained floor, the still body of the boy who had somehow upended everything. In the back of his mind, a small insistent voice whispered that there was no going back from this, that the life he had once taken for granted was over. But the enormity of it all was too much to process. For now, he could only sit in stunned silence, waiting for the storm that was about to descend on them. The air outside was stifling, and the thick tension in the Keaton household felt as though it might collapse under its own weight. David sat motionless by the window, staring blankly at the front lawn, where neatly trimmed hedges cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Time seemed to stretch and warp, his mind stuck on a loop, replaying the moment he'd struck Mark over and over again. Every second that passed only served to deepen the pit of dread that had settled in his chest. Outside, the world continued, oblivious to the chaos that had just unfolded within the pristine walls of their home. But soon, the flashing lights of approaching squad cars and the wailing sirens disrupted the fragile stillness. Neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, murmuring in disbelief, while the police car sped toward the Keaton residence, signaling that something had gone terribly wrong in the heart of Silverwood Estates. Detective Naomi Blake had been in her office at the Austin Police Department when the call came in. A domestic disturbance turned violent, potential homicide, upper-class suburban neighborhood. Nothing unusual on the surface. But she'd learned early in her career that the neat facades of suburban life often hid the darkest secrets. She arrived at the Keaton residence minutes later, stepping out of her vehicle just as the paramedics were wheeling Mark Holloway's lifeless body out of the house on a stretcher. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene. The blood-stained carpet, the broken vase lying in jagged pieces on the floor, the unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. Years of experience told her that this wasn't just some random fight gone wrong. This was personal. The murder weapon, a heavy decorative vase, lay on the ground where David had dropped it, smeared with blood and glass shards. The crimson splatter on the white walls was a grotesque contrast to the modern elegance of the Keaton home. The first responders had already spoken to David and Rachel, who were both in different states of shock. David was still seated by the window, his head buried in his hands, his clothes streaked with blood. Rachel, on the other hand, was sobbing uncontrollably in the living room, her face pale and tear-streaked, trembling from head to toe. Detective Blake took a moment to observe them from afar before approaching, trying to piece together the dynamics at play. Whatever had happened in this house had torn apart not only the people involved, but the very fabric of their lives. She could see it clearly. The perfect suburban life crumbling in an instant. The investigation officially began with the meticulous collection of forensic evidence. Crime scene investigators moved about the house with silent precision, cataloging every bloodstain, every shattered object, every trace that could help them reconstruct what had happened. Blake knew the first step in a case like this was to take a step back and let the scene speak for itself. Every object, every mark, every trace of evidence held a clue to what had transpired. The autopsy report would later reveal the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with the impact of the vase. But there was something that struck Blake as odd. Mark hadn't died instantly. According to the medical examiner, he had likely remained conscious for a short time after the blow, only to succumb to his injuries minutes later. Why had David left him lying there? Why hadn't anyone called for help sooner? Those questions gnawed at Blake as she made her way through the house. From the blood patterns on the floor and the overturned furniture, it was clear that the confrontation had been violent and sudden, but something about the scene didn't sit right with her. The rage she sensed, the intensity of the violence, spoke of more than just a crime of passion. There was a darkness in this house that ran deeper than a single moment of fury. As Blake continued her examination, a young patrol officer approached her. "Detective, the neighbors are starting to gather outside. You might want to talk to a few of them while we finish up in here." Blake nodded, glancing out the window at the growing crowd of curious onlookers. Silverwood Estates was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. And now, in the span of a few hours, the community had been thrust into the middle of a gruesome crime scene. The neighbors were buzzing with questions and speculation, and Blake knew that at least some of them might have noticed something important. Outside, the neighbors whispered in hushed tones as Detective Blake approached the perimeter. The perfectly manicured lawns and pristine driveways of Silverwood Estates seemed surreal, given the gravity of what had just taken place. A murder in broad daylight, right next door, was enough to shake even the most complacent suburbanites. Sandra and Jim Larkin, an older couple who lived directly across from the Keatons, had already gathered near the scene, talking to other residents. Sandra had been the one to call 911 after hearing the sound of glass shattering, followed by Rachel's panicked screams. She hadn't seen the actual confrontation, but she knew something terrible had happened the moment she heard the commotion. "I didn't know what was going on at first," she told Blake, her voice wavering slightly. "But when I heard the screaming, I knew it wasn't just an argument. I could feel it in my bones. Something awful had happened." Blake took note of the details, her mind spinning with possibilities. Neighbors had noticed that Mark's car had been parked down the street for hours, which raised another red flag. It wasn't uncommon for him to be at the Keaton house. But the timing, the secrecy of it all, it didn't add up. One neighbor, Bob Whitman, who lived 2 houses down, mentioned seeing Mark enter the Keaton home earlier that day. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but the knowledge of what had happened now made him suspicious. It was odd, he murmured, as if still trying to piece things together in his own mind. Mark usually only stopped by to help with the yard, but today, something felt different. Blake kept the neighbor's observations in mind as she walked back to the house. The more pieces of the puzzle she gathered, the more she began to realize that this wasn't just a case of a husband catching his wife in an affair. The violence, the sheer force of the attack, and the overwhelming emotional reactions all pointed to something deeper. Inside, Rachel sat in the corner of the living room, her legs tucked beneath her, rocking slightly as if trying to comfort herself. Her eyes were vacant, staring off into space, as though she were trying to escape from the nightmare that had become her reality. Every now and then, she would mutter something under her breath, fragments of sentences that Blake couldn't quite make out. Guilt, grief, shock, they all warred for dominance on her face. David, on the other hand, hadn't moved from his spot by the window. His breathing had slowed, but his mind was still racing, caught somewhere between denial and horror. He wasn't ready to face the full weight of what he had done. Blake could see it in his eyes. The way he avoided looking at Mark's body, the way his hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. He wasn't ready to admit to himself, let alone to anyone else, what had truly happened. As the hours dragged on, the investigation shifted from initial chaos to methodical inquiry. Blake's focus was now on pulling apart the lives of the Keatons and the Holloways, one thread at a time. The affair, the secrets, the betrayal. All of it was only the surface of something much darker, something that had been simmering beneath the polished exteriors of suburban life. The truth was still out there, waiting to be unearthed. Detective Naomi Blake knew that unraveling the truth in a case like this would take time. The violent aftermath she had witnessed in the Keaton home was just the tip of the iceberg. Behind every act of violence, there were hidden motives, buried emotions, and secrets that slowly began to bubble to the surface once pressure was applied. And in Silverwood Estates, a place built on appearances and polished facades, those secrets often ran deep. The morning after the murder, Blake sat in her office, reviewing the evidence collected so far. The Keaton residence, with its pristine exterior and tastefully decorated interior, had yielded a trove of forensic clues. The shattered vase that David had used to strike Mark, the bloodstains that told a story of a desperate struggle, and the fingerprints that confirmed Rachel's and David's presence in the room at critical moments. The crime scene had spoken, but it was the people behind the event that interested Blake the most. She had arranged for a series of interviews with the key figures involved, David, Rachel, and their neighbors, to begin piecing together what had led to that moment of violence. But before any of that could happen, Blake had a more pressing task: understanding Mark Holloway. The 19-year-old college student had gone from being the quiet, responsible neighbor to the victim of a brutal crime. And yet there was still so much they didn't know about him. To fully understand the dynamics at play, Blake needed to look beyond the surface of the affair and into Mark's life. Mark had been the kind of young man who seemed to fade into the background, quiet, unassuming, focused on his studies. But as Blake dove deeper into his world, she began to uncover a more complicated portrait of the boy who had once been a shadow in Silverwood Estates. He had lived alone with his mother, Carol, since the death of his father 5 years prior. The loss had been devastating for both of them, but while Carol had retreated into her work as a librarian and her grief-stricken routine, Mark had thrown himself into his studies. He excelled academically and had secured a scholarship to study computer engineering at a nearby university. To his neighbors, Mark was the perfect son, respectful, responsible, and polite. But as Blake began to review Mark's digital life, his phone records, emails, and social media activity, another side of him began to emerge. Mark, it seemed, had been struggling more than anyone knew. His quiet demeanor had masked a deep-seated insecurity, particularly in the realm of personal relationships. His academic success had done little to ease the sense of isolation he felt among his peers. He wasn't like the other boys at college, those who went to parties, drank heavily, and paraded their girlfriends around. Mark had always been introverted, preferring the company of books and computers to that of his classmates. But that loneliness had festered inside him, creating a longing to be seen, to be desired. This yearning for validation had collided with his interactions with Rachel Keaton. Blake's investigation uncovered the gradual progression of their relationship. What had started as innocent flirtation had quickly spiraled into a full-blown affair. In text messages recovered from Mark's phone, Blake saw the intense emotions that had driven him to take increasingly reckless risks. There were long exchanges between him and Rachel, filled with confessions of desire, guilt, and a yearning for something more than the secret meetings they'd been sharing. But there was something else in the messages, an undercurrent of emotional manipulation that began to stand out the more Blake read. Mark, though young and inexperienced, had found a way to leverage Rachel's loneliness and discontent for his own emotional gain. He would send her texts that alternated between declarations of affection and thinly veiled threats of ending things if she didn't meet him. Rachel, trapped in her own web of guilt and longing, seemed torn between her attraction to him and the realization that their relationship was destructive. Yet, they continued on, unable to stop. Blake could sense the toxicity of their relationship through these exchanges. Mark, though initially a victim, had not been entirely passive in the events leading up to his death. There was a certain desperation in his words, a need to cling to the one source of validation he had found in Rachel, despite the consequences. Rachel's role in this tragedy was becoming clearer with each passing hour, but Blake still needed to understand her mindset. She was scheduled to be interviewed later that afternoon, but already Blake had a sense of the immense guilt weighing down on her. Rachel hadn't intended for things to spiral this far out of control, but she had been reckless, not just with her marriage, but with Mark's life. Blake had spent the morning reviewing more of Rachel's background. A former art gallery curator, Rachel had once been a rising star in the world of modern art. Her career had been filled with passion, creativity, and excitement. But when she married David and moved to Silverwood, her life had changed dramatically. The suburbs, with their routine predictability and social obligations, had suffocated her artistic soul. The gallery had closed soon after, and Rachel had become a stay-at-home wife, hosting neighborhood events and leading yoga classes. But these activities never filled the void left by her creative ambitions. It was clear that Rachel had been struggling long before Mark entered her life. Her marriage to David had slowly deteriorated over the years, a fact she had confided in a few close friends. In Rachel's mind, the affair had been an escape from her stagnant life, a way to feel alive again. But now, as Blake prepared to question her, it was obvious that the guilt of Mark's death weighed heavily on her. She was not only responsible for betraying her husband, but also for the consequences that had followed. The texts between her and Mark had revealed how deeply entwined she had become in his life. She had been his confidant, his source of comfort, and ultimately his lover. But she had also been complicit in the emotional chaos that had led to his death. She had known deep down that what they were doing was wrong, but the allure of feeling wanted, of being seen again, had been too powerful to resist. As Blake's investigation into Rachel and Mark deepened, the picture of David Keaton's life was also beginning to take shape. David's career as a real estate developer had been on the rise for years, but it had come at a cost. His work demanded long hours, constant networking, and a level of dedication that left little room for personal life. Rachel had once admired his ambition, but over time, that same ambition had become a source of their estrangement. Blake reviewed financial records and work schedules that painted a stark picture. David had spent more time in meetings and conferences than he had at home. The pressure to secure lucrative deals had pushed him further away from Rachel, and in her absence, she had sought solace elsewhere. But David wasn't completely oblivious. In the weeks leading up to Mark's death, there had been subtle signs that something was wrong. David's growing distance from his wife had not gone unnoticed, and while he had buried his suspicions beneath work, the cracks were beginning to show. Colleagues at David's firm described him as driven, intensely focused, and occasionally difficult to be around. The pressure of closing major real estate deals had taken its toll on him, and it seemed that his professional success was masking personal failures at home. Blake could see that David's life was on the verge of collapse, even before the murder had taken place. The perfect image he had cultivated over the years was beginning to crumble, and now, with Mark's death, everything was falling apart. Blake understood that David's rage had been fueled by years of suppressed frustration. The affair had been the catalyst, but the true source of his anger had been festering for years. His inability to connect with Rachel, the pressures of his career, and the loss of control in his own life had all contributed to the violent outburst that had left Mark dead. Silverwood Estates was not immune to the effects of this tragedy. The news of Mark's death had spread quickly, and by now, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with speculation. Blake heard snippets of conversations as she walked through the neighborhood. Whispers about the Keatons' failing marriage, about Mark's odd behavior in recent months, and about the guilt that seemed to hang over Rachel like a dark cloud. The community, once close-knit and idyllic, was now divided. Some blamed Rachel for the affair, while others viewed David as the true villain of the story. The Holloways, especially Carol, had become the subject of pity and concern. Losing a son under such circumstances was unimaginable, and the neighbors' sympathy for her was palpable. But beneath the surface, Blake could sense something darker in the neighborhood. There was a pervasive unease, a sense that everyone had been too focused on maintaining appearances to notice the cracks beneath. Silverwood Estates had always prided itself on its pristine lawns and family-friendly events. But the truth was that it had been built on a foundation of secrets, lies, and unspoken tensions. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Blake knew that the investigation was far from over. She still needed to interview Rachel, to hear her side of the story, to understand the full extent of her involvement with Mark. She needed to get into David's head, to figure out what had finally pushed him over the edge. And she needed to learn more about Mark, about the boy who had lived a double life, caught between a desire for validation and the emotional chaos that had ultimately led to his death. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. But as Blake prepared for the long days ahead, she knew that what she would find would be far more complicated than a simple crime of passion. The lives of the Keatons, the Holloways, and the entire community of Silverwood Estates had been irrevocably changed, and there was no going back. In the days following the murder, Silverwood Estates became a hive of hushed conversations, whispered accusations, and a palpable sense of unease. The peace and order that had defined the community for years had been irrevocably broken. What once seemed like an ideal neighborhood was now marred by tragedy, and the facade of suburban perfection was slipping away, revealing the darker realities that lay beneath. Detective Naomi Blake knew this type of disruption well. Communities like Silverwood were built on appearances of happiness, of stability, of control. But behind every polished smile and trimmed hedge were tensions, frustrations, and secrets just waiting to explode. And now, that explosion had taken the form of a brutal crime, shaking the very foundations of the neighborhood. Silverwood's residents were still reeling from the events that had unfolded in the Keaton home. As the news spread about Mark Holloway's death and David Keaton's arrest, the community's reactions ranged from shock to disbelief to thinly veiled judgment. Some neighbors who had been close to the Keatons could hardly believe what had happened, while others whispered about the affair and the tragedy. With a mixture of morbid fascination and self-righteousness, rumors began to spread like wildfire. Sandra Larkin, who had been the first to call 911, had become the unofficial source of information, sharing details she'd overheard and adding fuel to the speculation. Some claimed they had seen Mark's car parked at the Keaton house for weeks, while others wondered aloud how Rachel could have let things go so far with a boy half her age. Conversations were held in corners, at coffee shops, and over backyard fences, as the residents of Silverwood tried to make sense of what had happened. But no one felt the weight of the tragedy more than Carol Holloway. For years she had been a quiet figure in the neighborhood, a grieving widow who kept to herself and focused on raising her son. Now, the same people who had offered her sympathy were speaking in hushed tones about her family, questioning how she could have been unaware of Mark's involvement with Rachel. Carol, still in shock from the loss of her son, found herself inundated with condolences, but the sympathy felt hollow in the face of her overwhelming grief. She had known Mark was spending time at the Keaton house, but she had never suspected anything beyond the usual yard work and handyman jobs. The thought that her son, her brilliant, quiet, responsible boy, had been caught up in such a scandal was unfathomable. She had always believed she knew him, but now she questioned how much of his life she had truly understood, and that question only deepened her grief. While the community buzzed with gossip, Detective Naomi Blake continued her methodical investigation. She had gathered the physical evidence from the crime scene, spoken to several key witnesses, and reviewed the autopsy report, confirming that Mark had died from blunt force trauma. But the psychological layers of the case, what had led David to commit the murder, and how Rachel's affair with Mark had developed, were still unclear. Blake knew that the answers lay in understanding the relationships between the people involved. Rachel was the key to all of this, and Blake was preparing to interview her at length. The fragmented details that had emerged so far painted a picture of a woman torn between her guilt, her longing for something more, and the tragedy that had unfolded as a result of her choices. But Blake knew there was more to Rachel's story. She needed to uncover the emotional and psychological dynamics that had led her to cross a line with Mark Holloway, a boy young enough to be her son. Rachel Keaton had always been seen as a fixture of Silverwood's social circles, the hostess at charity events, the woman leading yoga classes, the wife of a successful businessman. But now, she found herself isolated, both physically and emotionally. After the events of that fateful afternoon, she had withdrawn completely from the community. The whispers, the looks, the pity, all of it had become too much to bear. Rachel hadn't spoken to David since the murder, and the silence between them had grown even more deafening now that he was in police custody. She had always known their marriage was fragile, built more on obligation and appearances than real love. But the moment David walked into the bedroom and saw her with Mark, everything shattered. In that instant, all the lies they had told themselves about their lives had come crashing down. As she sat in the living room of her now quiet home, Rachel felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. The weight of Mark's death pressed down on her chest like a physical burden, and the reality of what had happened was impossible to escape. She had been careless, selfish. She had let her loneliness and dissatisfaction lead her into a relationship with Mark, knowing it could only end in disaster. And now, it had, but there was more than just guilt. Deep down, Rachel knew that she had been complicit in something far more toxic than a simple affair. Mark had been vulnerable, emotionally isolated, and desperate for validation, and she had taken advantage of that. Their relationship had started as a flirtation, but it had quickly spiraled into something destructive, driven by her need to feel desired and his need to feel important. And now, Mark was dead because of it. While Rachel grappled with her guilt, David sat in a holding cell at the police station, staring blankly at the walls. The events of the last few days had left him numb, unable to fully process the reality of what he had done. He had killed a young man, a boy he had trusted to help around the house, someone he had known for years. The thought played over and over in his mind, but it still didn't feel real. David had spent years burying his emotions, hiding behind his work and his responsibilities, pretending that everything was fine. But the truth was that his life had been falling apart long before he walked in on Rachel and Mark. The long hours, the pressure to succeed, the growing distance between him and his wife, all of it had been slowly eroding the foundation of his life. He had just refused to see it. Now, as he sat alone, the enormity of his actions began to sink in. He could still see Mark's face, the look of shock and fear just before the vase had connected with his head. David had never intended to kill him, but in that moment of blind rage, he had lost control, and now nothing would ever be the same. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the case was far from simple. David had admitted to the attack, but his lawyer was already preparing a defense that painted him as a man driven to the edge by his wife's betrayal. The affair between Rachel and Mark was the focal point, and the prosecution was eager to prove that David had acted out of jealousy and rage, rather than self-defense or momentary loss of control. The legal proceedings were already becoming a topic of fascination for the media. Reporters were camped outside the Keaton home and the courthouse, eager to cover every twist and turn of the case. The affair between a married woman and a much younger man, the brutal murder in the heat of passion. It was the kind of scandal that attracted headlines, but for Blake, the media attention was a distraction. Her focus remained on uncovering the truth, no matter how messy or complicated it was. She knew that the trial would hinge on the emotional and psychological dynamics at play, David's mental state, Rachel's guilt, and Mark's vulnerability. And the more she uncovered about these dynamics, the clearer it became that this was not just a case of a husband snapping in the heat of the moment. It was a tragedy years in the making, rooted in the lies, secrets, and betrayals that had been festering beneath the surface of Silverwood Estates. As the trial loomed, the residents of Silverwood continued to process the fallout from the murder. Some sided with David, seeing him as a victim of his wife's infidelity, driven to violence by her betrayal. Others felt sympathy for Rachel, viewing her as a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, seeking solace in a forbidden relationship. But no one could deny that Mark's death had left a scar on the entire neighborhood. The Holloways, once seen as quiet and respectable, were now at the center of the tragedy. Carol Holloway, devastated by the loss of her son, was left to pick up the pieces of her life, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. Her grief was compounded by the knowledge that her son had been involved in something so reckless, so destructive. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to hate Rachel. The woman who had once been her neighbor, her friend, was now just another victim of the same tragedy that had claimed Mark's life. As the investigation deepened and the trial drew closer, the tension in Silverwood Estates continued to rise. The perfect image of the neighborhood had been shattered, and no one knew how to put it back together. Friendships had been strained, marriages were under scrutiny, and the once peaceful streets were now filled with an air of suspicion and mistrust. Detective Blake, ever the observer, watched as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. But even as she pieced together the events that had led to Mark's death, she knew that the real truth, the emotional truth, was far more complicated. The lives of the Keatons, the Holloways, and the entire community of Silverwood had been forever altered. And there was no going back to the way things were. Detective Naomi Blake sat in her office, surrounded by piles of evidence, transcripts, and crime scene photos. The Keaton case had consumed her for weeks, and every piece of the puzzle revealed a darker side to the seemingly perfect lives in Silverwood Estates. But despite all the forensic details and testimonies, Blake knew that this case was more than just a crime of passion. It was about people trapped in their lives, making choices that spiraled into tragedy. As she reviewed her notes, Blake's mind lingered on one particular detail: the increasing emotional turmoil between Rachel and Mark. It had started as a reckless affair, but it had become clear through their text messages and emails that Mark had become deeply attached to Rachel. There was a possessiveness in his words, a growing desperation that hinted at an emotional dependency far beyond what anyone had suspected. Blake realized that Mark had been looking for something far more than just a physical connection. He was seeking validation, an anchor in a world where he felt adrift. For Rachel, it had been about escaping the confines of her stagnant marriage. But for Mark, it had been something deeper, a way to feel important, to be seen as an adult by someone older, someone who represented a life he could never have. As the investigation continued, the complexity of the affair between Rachel and Mark became even more evident. Their relationship had been tumultuous, filled with intense emotions, and punctuated by moments of guilt and doubt on both sides. Mark had grown increasingly frustrated with Rachel's reluctance to leave David, while Rachel, torn between her attraction to Mark and her fear of destroying her marriage, had begun to pull away. The final days leading up to the murder painted a picture of two people spiraling out of control. Rachel had tried to end the affair several times, but Mark's increasingly erratic behavior made it difficult. He had become emotionally volatile, sending her messages late at night, accusing her of abandoning him, demanding more of her time and attention. Rachel, afraid of how things were escalating, had agreed to meet him one last time, unaware that David would come home early that day. Blake had pieced together that David's discovery of the affair had been the culmination of months of tension in the Keaton household. His own frustrations with his career and his deteriorating marriage had left him emotionally fragile. The sight of his wife with Mark had pushed him over the edge, unleashing years of pent-up anger and disappointment in a single violent moment. The trial of David Keaton began in early November. The media had descended on the courthouse, eager to cover the scandalous details of the case. A suburban love triangle gone horribly wrong. The prosecution argued that David had acted out of pure rage, a man who couldn't handle the humiliation of his wife's betrayal. They painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer, a man who had brutally murdered a young man in a fit of jealousy. But David's defense team took a different approach. They portrayed him as a devoted husband, pushed to his breaking point by years of emotional neglect and betrayal. They argued that the murder was not premeditated, but rather the result of a sudden and uncontrollable outburst of emotion. They called expert witnesses to testify about David's high-stress job, his deteriorating mental health, and the psychological trauma of discovering his wife's affair in the most intimate way possible. Rachel's testimony was the most anticipated part of the trial. When she finally took the stand, she was a shadow of the woman she had once been. The confident, vibrant hostess of Silverwood Estates was gone, replaced by someone hollowed out by guilt and grief. As she recounted the details of her affair with Mark, the courtroom was silent. She spoke of the loneliness she had felt in her marriage, the excitement and validation Mark had offered her, and the overwhelming guilt that had consumed her after his death. But it was when she described the final moments in the bedroom that the courtroom held its breath. She admitted that she had tried to push Mark away when David entered the room, that she had screamed for them to stop, but by then it had been too late. Her words painted a picture of a woman trapped by her own choices, watching helplessly as her world crumbled around her. The jury deliberated for days, weighing the emotional and legal complexities of the case. The evidence of David's violent outburst was undeniable, but his defense had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the jurors. Was this truly a premeditated murder, or had David simply lost control in a moment of emotional devastation? The line between guilt and innocence was blurred by the layers of psychological trauma and betrayal. In the end, the jury returned with a verdict of manslaughter rather than second-degree murder. David Keaton was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 10 years. It was a decision that left the courtroom divided. Some believed justice had been served, while others felt the sentence was too lenient for the loss of a young life. As David was led away in handcuffs, Rachel sat in the back of the courtroom, her face expressionless. She had been spared legal consequences, but the emotional toll of what had happened was a life sentence of its own. The community of Silverwood Estates had once viewed her as the perfect wife, the ideal neighbor, but now She was a pariah, a woman marked by scandal and tragedy. She would leave the neighborhood soon after the trial, disappearing from the life she had once known. The ripple effects of Mark Holloway's death continued to be felt in Silverwood Estates long after the trial ended. The once close community had been fractured by the events, and neighbors who had once shared barbecues and holiday parties now avoided one another. The scandal had left an indelible mark, and the quiet, orderly streets of Silverwood now seemed haunted by the memory of what had happened. Carol Holloway, still mourning the loss of her son, had retreated into isolation. The sympathy from neighbors and friends had dried up, replaced by awkward silences and avoidance. She had lost not just her son, but the life she had built in Silverwood. Eventually, she would move away, unable to bear the constant reminders of what she had lost. For Detective Naomi Blake, the case had been a reminder of how fragile people's lives truly were. The layers of secrets and lies that had unraveled during the investigation had revealed the emotional turmoil simmering beneath the surface of the Keatons' lives. It had been a case driven by human weakness, by desires left unfulfilled, by emotional neglect, and by the desperation to be seen. It wasn't the kind of case that had clear answers or satisfying conclusions, but it was one that would stay with her for a long time. The tragedy of Silverwood Estates was not just about the death of Mark Holloway, but about the unraveling of lives built on appearances and silence. The people involved, David, Rachel, and even Mark, had all been caught in a web of their own making, bound by choices that had spiraled out of control. The consequences of those choices would linger long after the trial had ended. For the residents of Silverwood, the Keaton tragedy was a stark reminder that no one's life was as perfect as it seemed from the outside. The carefully curated image of suburban bliss had been shattered, and in its place was a sobering truth. Behind every closed door, there were secrets. Some of those secrets stayed buried forever, but others, like the ones in the Keaton home, had a way of bursting to the surface in the most devastating way possible. And in the end, the tragedy wasn't just about a murder. It was about the fragility of human relationships, the destructive power of lies, and the emotional toll of living lives that don't align with the truth.